Nobody in the mess hall knew why the German women were crying. Not at first. Texas, late spring 1945. The morning sun had barely climbed above the horizon when the transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Mason, a prisoner work camp built on the edge of a wide stretch of farmland, nearly 70 miles outside San Antonio. Dust drifted behind the convoy like pale smoke, hanging motionless in the warm air. The war in Europe had ended only weeks earlier, but its shadow still lingered in places like this. The camp sat between fields of wheat and cattle pasture, surrounded by wire fences that shimmered beneath the Texas heat. Watchtowers stood at the corners, though most days the guards seemed more concerned with the weather than with escape attempts. The prisoners arriving that morning were different from the men who had filled the camp throughout the war. These were women. 43 German women, most of them nurses, clerks, radio operators, and civilian auxiliaries who had been captured during the final months of fighting. They stepped down from the trucks carrying small canvas bags and almost nothing else. Their uniforms were faded from travel. Their faces carried the exhaustion of people who had crossed oceans and continents without knowing where they would finally stop. Lieutenant James Walker stood near the administration building, a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. 31 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, and born on a wheat farm outside Wichita, Kansas, he had spent most of the war processing paperwork and managing labor assignments. He was not a hero. He was not a politician. He was simply a man trying to do his job. As the women formed lines for registration, he watched them quietly. Some stared at the ground. Some looked toward the fields. Others seemed too tired to focus on anything at all. Nothing about them appeared unusual. Nothing suggested that by the end of the day, they would leave an impression he would remember for the rest of his life. The registration process lasted nearly 2 hours. Names were recorded. Medical files were checked. Work assignments were distributed. The women answered questions through translators and signed forms they barely understood. By late morning, the Texas heat had already begun to settle over the camp like a heavy blanket. Cicadas buzzed from nearby trees. Somewhere beyond the fence, cattle lowed across open pasture. Eventually a bell rang from the center of camp. Lunch. The sound echoed across the compound. Guards headed toward the mess hall. Workers put down tools. The newly arrived prisoners were directed toward a long wooden building painted white, its screened windows standing open to catch whatever breeze might pass through. James followed several minutes later. Inside, the mess hall smelled of coffee, fresh bread, and roasted chicken. Long rows of tables stretched beneath ceiling fans that turned lazily overhead. Trays had already been prepared. Bread rolls still warm from the ovens. Butter wrapped in paper squares. Green beans. Mashed potatoes. Chicken. Coffee. Nothing extravagant by American standards. Just a normal meal. The sort of lunch many Americans would barely remember by the next morning. The German women entered cautiously. They carried their trays and searched for seats. Conversations from American personnel filled the room. Metal utensils clinked softly against plates. Someone laughed near the serving line. Everything felt ordinary. Then something unexpected happened. A woman near the center table stopped walking. Her tray trembled in her hands. She stared down at the food. For a moment she didn't move. Then tears appeared in her eyes. She lowered herself into a chair and quietly began crying. Across the room another woman covered her mouth. A third wiped tears from her cheeks. Within minutes more of them were crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears falling onto untouched trays. The room slowly grew quiet. American soldiers exchanged confused glances. A cook paused beside the serving counter. One guard looked toward another and shrugged. Nobody understood what was happening. A young private sitting near the entrance finally broke the silence. "Did somebody die?" he asked. No one answered. The women simply sat there looking at their meals. Some stared at the bread. Some looked down into their coffee cups. One woman pressed both hands against her face. Another closed her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. Lieutenant Walker watched the scene from across the room. He expected someone to explain it. No one did. The translator assigned to the camp appeared just as confused as everyone else. "What's wrong with them?" one of the cooks whispered. "I don't know," another replied. "Maybe they got bad news." But no bad news had arrived. There were no telegrams. No announcements. Nothing had happened except lunch. James studied the women carefully. Years of working around prisoners had taught him how to recognize fear. This wasn't fear. He knew what grief looked like. It wasn't exactly grief either. There was something different in their expressions. Something quieter, stranger, more personal. One woman in particular caught his attention. She sat near the far window, mid-20s, blonde hair pinned neatly behind her head, thin but composed. Her name, according to the morning paperwork, was Elizabeth Bauer. She hadn't touched her meal. Instead, she stared at the bread roll resting beside her tray. Tears rolled silently down her face. Yet her expression wasn't one of despair. It almost looked like disbelief. James watched as she carefully reached toward the bread. Her fingers touched it gently, as though she needed proof that it was real. Then she looked away and wiped her eyes. The mystery deepened. Around her, other women displayed the same reaction. Some cried quietly. Some stared. Some simply sat motionless. The room remained unusually silent. Even the soldiers seemed reluctant to speak. Finally, Elizabeth picked up the bread roll. She held it in both hands. Not eating. Not moving. Just holding it. Like someone holding an object from another lifetime. A memory made solid. James felt a strange sensation settle in his chest. Curiosity. The kind that refused to leave. Whatever was happening inside that mess hall had nothing to do with military reports or prisoner regulations. Something invisible was unfolding right in front of him. Something none of the Americans understood. Outside, the Texas sun continued climbing higher. The field shimmered beyond the fence. The fans hummed overhead. Lunch continued. Yet for the rest of that afternoon, one question followed Lieutenant James Walker everywhere he went. Why were the German women crying? And though nobody knew it yet, the answer would change the way many of the Americans inside Camp Mason saw those women forever. The question followed Lieutenant James Walker through the rest of the afternoon like a shadow that refused to leave. He finished paperwork. He reviewed labor assignments. He signed supply requests stacked neatly on his desk. Yet every few minutes his thoughts drifted back to the mess hall, and the sight of those women sitting silently with tears in their eyes. Camp Mason had processed hundreds of prisoners during the war. Men from North Africa. Sailors captured at sea. Pilots whose aircraft had landed far from home. James had seen anger, fear, relief, resentment. But he had never seen anything quite like what happened at lunch. Late that afternoon, the temperature climbed past 90 degrees. Heat waves shimmered above the dirt roads that connected the camp buildings. The scent of dry grass drifted across the compound whenever the wind stirred. Most of the newly arrived women had been assigned temporary work details until permanent placements could be arranged. Some helped organize medical supplies. Others sorted clothing shipments. Several worked in the camp laundry. Simple tasks. Routine tasks. Nothing difficult. James left his office shortly before 4 o'clock and walked across the camp. The sunlight reflected off the white walls of the barracks. Somewhere nearby, a radio played softly from an open window. Big band music floated through the warm air. A maintenance crew repaired a fence near the southern edge of camp. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet he noticed something unusual again. The German women moved quietly. Not withdrawn. Not frightened. Simply quiet. They spoke among themselves in low voices. They worked carefully. They followed instructions. But every so often he would catch one of them staring into the distance with an expression he could not fully understand. As though part of her mind remained somewhere thousands of miles away. Near the supply warehouse he spotted Elizabeth Bauer carrying a stack of folded linens. She walked with measured steps beneath the afternoon sun. Her posture remained straight despite obvious fatigue. When she reached the warehouse door, another woman said something in German. Elizabeth smiled faintly. It was the first time James had seen her smile at all. The expression lasted only a moment before disappearing. He stood there watching longer than he intended. Not because of her appearance. Not because of curiosity alone. There was simply something about her calmness that stood apart from the others. She carried herself like someone who had learned long ago how to survive difficult circumstances without complaint. Eventually he continued walking. At dinner that evening, he returned to the mess hall earlier than usual. He wanted to observe. The same ceiling fans rotated overhead. The same scent of coffee drifted through the building. Trays lined the serving counter. Fresh cornbread sat beside large metal containers of stew. The women entered in groups and took their seats. This time there were no tears. At least not immediately. The conversations around the room continued normally. Soldiers discussed baseball scores. A cook complained about the heat. Someone laughed near the coffee station. Everything appeared ordinary. Then James noticed Elizabeth again. She sat near the same window she had occupied at lunch. A small bread roll rested beside her tray. She picked it up carefully. Too carefully. Almost reverently. Then she folded a paper napkin around it and slipped it into her pocket instead of eating it. James blinked. He thought perhaps he had imagined it. But moments later he noticed another woman doing the same thing. Then another. Bread disappearing into pockets. Napkins folded with unusual care. No one else seemed to notice. To most people it was nothing. To James it felt important. He could not explain why. After dinner, he remained in the hall as the tables emptied. The last prisoners filed out toward the barracks. Workers cleaned dishes. The sound of running water echoed from the kitchen. One of the cooks, a broad-shouldered man named Frank Reynolds, wiped his hands on a towel and approached James. "You have been staring at those women all day," Frank said. James laughed softly. "Have I?" "You have." Frank glanced toward the door. "Trying to solve the mystery?" James looked across the nearly empty hall. "Something does not add up." Frank nodded slowly. "I noticed the crying too. What do you think it means?" Frank shrugged. "Maybe they are homesick." Maybe. But James was not convinced. Homesickness explained some things. Not all things. It certainly did not explain the bread disappearing into pockets. Outside, dusk settled gradually across Camp Mason. The sky shifted from bright blue to deep orange. Long shadows stretched across the fields. The heat finally began to loosen its grip. James walked toward the barracks area as evening approached. Crickets had already begun their nightly chorus. The distant sound of cattle drifted from a neighboring ranch. It would have been a peaceful evening under ordinary circumstances. As he passed one of the women's barracks, he noticed movement through an open window. Inside, several women sat on their bunks. A single lamp cast soft yellow light across the room. They appeared to be sorting personal belongings. Nothing unusual. Then he saw something that stopped him. On a small wooden crate near the center of the room sat several neatly folded napkins. Beside them rested pieces of bread, small packets of sugar, a few unopened butter portions from the mess hall. The women handled each item carefully, almost ceremonially. One woman wrapped a sugar packet inside a handkerchief. Another placed a bread roll into a cloth pouch. No one was eating. No one was hoarding food for the night. Their actions seemed deliberate, purposeful. Yet James still could not understand the purpose. He moved away before they noticed him watching. The image stayed with him. Later that evening, he sat alone outside his office. The temperature had finally dropped below 80 degrees. A warm breeze rustled the nearby trees. He removed his cap and leaned back in his chair. Across the compound, lights glowed softly inside the barracks. Most of the camp had settled into quiet routine. But not his thoughts. Something about those folded napkins, those sugar packets, those untouched bread rolls. The pieces were there. He simply could not fit them together. A few minutes later, footsteps approached along the gravel path. It was Samuel Ortiz, one of the translators assigned to the camp. Samuel carried a cup of coffee and lowered himself into the chair beside James. For a while neither man spoke. They listened to the evening sounds drifting through the darkness. Finally James broke the silence. "Samuel." "Yes." "Have any of the women explained why they were crying?" Samuel shook his head. "No. Not even indirectly. Nothing." James stared toward the distant barracks. "Then why do I feel like they are trying to tell us something?" Samuel followed his gaze. For several seconds he remained silent. Then he said something unexpected. "Maybe they are." James turned toward him. Samuel took a sip of coffee. "The problem is that we keep looking for words." He nodded toward the sleeping camp. "Maybe the answer is in what they are doing." The comment lingered long after Samuel left. James sat there beneath the Texas night sky watching the lights in the barracks windows. Somewhere inside one of those buildings, Elizabeth Bauer and the others were carefully saving things most Americans barely noticed. Bread, sugar, napkins, small ordinary items. Things so common that nobody gave them a second thought. Yet somehow those simple objects seemed connected to the tears in the mess hall, connected to the silence, connected to a story nobody had told yet. And for the first time, James began to suspect that the truth might be far more complicated than anyone imagined. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale gold sunlight, and the distant sound of cattle moving across the neighboring ranch's camp. Mason woke slowly. A whistle blew near the maintenance sheds. Screen doors opened and closed. Coffee brewed in the mess hall kitchen. The familiar rhythm of another day settled across the compound. Yet Lieutenant James Walker found himself paying attention to details he normally would have ignored. During breakfast he watched the women again. Not openly. Not enough to make anyone uncomfortable. Just carefully. The same pattern appeared almost immediately. Several of the women slipped extra napkins into their pockets. One saved a sugar packet. Another folded a small piece of bread into a square of cloth. They performed the actions discreetly, almost automatically, as though repeating habits learned long ago. Most of the American personnel never noticed. Why would they? In a country where grocery shelves remained full and bread arrived fresh every morning, such things barely registered. But James noticed. The mystery was no longer shrinking. It was growing. By mid-morning the women had been assigned various duties around the camp. Elizabeth Bauer spent the day helping organize medical supplies inside a small clinic building near the northern fence. The structure had once been a storage shed before being converted into a treatment center for minor illnesses and routine examinations. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating rows of neatly arranged boxes, bottles, bandages, inventory forms. Quiet work. The kind that suited someone who preferred observation over conversation. Around 11 o'clock, James arrived carrying paperwork that required signatures from the camp physician. The doctor was away inspecting another facility, leaving only a few workers inside. Elizabeth stood at a wooden table sorting supplies by category. Gauze, antiseptic, thermometers. Her movements were precise, efficient. Every item placed exactly where it belonged. James paused near the doorway. For several moments neither spoke. The room smelled faintly of soap and fresh wood. Finally Elizabeth looked up. Their eyes met briefly. "Good morning," James said. Her English was better than he expected. "Good morning, Lieutenant." The accent remained noticeable but clear. James nodded toward the shelves. "Looks like they gave you plenty to do." A faint smile appeared. "It keeps the hands busy." The answer was simple. Yet something about it lingered. Keeps the hands busy. Not the mind. Not the heart. The hands. James glanced at the paperwork in his arms. "You worked in a hospital?" "Field clinic," she replied. "For several years." Her attention returned to the supplies. Conversation appeared finished. But curiosity pushed him forward. "You seem to know exactly where everything belongs." Elizabeth picked up a box of bandages. "Medical supplies are similar everywhere." Then she hesitated. "People are similar too." James studied her expression. There was no bitterness in her voice. No accusation. Only quiet certainty. He was about to respond when another worker entered carrying inventory forms. The moment passed. By noon the Texas heat had returned. Air shimmered above the camp roads. Cicadas screamed from nearby trees. Lunch arrived once again. James entered the mess hall expecting routine. Instead he noticed something else. Elizabeth sat alone for several minutes before the others joined her. In front of her rested a blank piece of paper. She stared at it while holding a pencil. Not writing. Simply staring. Eventually she began moving the pencil slowly across the page. Line after line. Word after word. When another woman approached, Elizabeth folded the paper immediately and tucked it away. James could not see what she had written. But later that afternoon he saw the same folded paper again. This time it sat partially visible beside her bunk through the open barracks window. A letter. The realization struck him instantly. A letter to someone back home. That evening Samuel Ortiz joined James for supper. The translator listened patiently as James described everything he had observed over the previous 2 days. The bread, the sugar packets, the folded napkins, the letters. Samuel remained quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question. Do you know whether their families survived? James frowned. Some probably did. Some probably did not. Samuel nodded slowly. Imagine not knowing. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Outside, sunset painted the sky orange and red beyond the western fence. The dining hall windows glowed softly in the fading light. Samuel stirred his coffee. Imagine receiving food every day while wondering whether your family has any food at all. James looked toward the women seated across the room. For the first time a possibility began forming. Not an answer. Not yet. Just a possibility. Later that night he walked alone through the camp. Warm air drifted across the fields. Crickets filled the darkness with steady music. Most lights had been switched off. Only a few windows remained illuminated. As he passed the women's barracks, he noticed movement near one of the windows. Elizabeth sat alone beside a small lamp. The folded letter lay open in front of her. She was reading it again. Not writing. Reading. Her expression remained calm. Yet there was sadness there too. Not dramatic sadness. The quiet kind. The kind that settles deep and stays for years. Beside the letter sat a small collection of carefully wrapped items. Sugar packets. Bread. Butter portions. Each arranged with surprising care. Almost like gifts. James stopped walking. Suddenly a thought entered his mind so clearly that it felt less like a theory and more like a memory he had somehow forgotten. What if none of those items were being saved for themselves? What if the women were saving them for someone else? The idea followed him back to his office. It followed him while he removed his jacket. It followed him while he reviewed reports beneath the yellow glow of a desk lamp. Outside, the camp gradually disappeared into silence. Yet one image refused to leave him. Elizabeth sitting beside that letter. Bread untouched. Sugar carefully wrapped. A look in her eyes that seemed fixed on a place far beyond Texas. Somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean. Somewhere where people she loved might still be waiting. And for the first time since the women arrived, James felt he was standing near the edge of the truth. Not close enough to see it clearly, but close enough to sense its shape. The following morning began with low clouds drifting across the Texas sky. For the first time in days, the sun remained hidden behind a pale gray layer that softened the heat and covered Camp Mason in a strange quiet light. Lieutenant James Walker arrived early. The camp was still waking up. Kitchen workers carried crates through the rear entrance of the mess hall. A truck unloaded supplies near the warehouse. Somewhere beyond the fences, a rooster crowed from a neighboring farm. Everything felt ordinary. Yet James carried the same question that had occupied his thoughts for nearly 3 days. He entered the mess hall before breakfast service began and sat alone near one of the windows. A cup of black coffee rested beside him. Steam curled upward into the cool morning air. One by one, the prisoners began entering the building. The German women moved quietly through the serving line. Trays slid across metal rails. Coffee poured into tin cups. Bread rolls were placed beside eggs and oatmeal. Nothing unusual. Then James noticed Elizabeth again. She paused at the end of the serving line for only a second. Most people would never have seen it. But he did. Her eyes lingered on a basket of bread. Not with hunger. Not with excitement. With something else. Something closer to concern. As though she were measuring the value of every piece. She carried her tray to the same table near the window. Several other women joined her. They exchanged brief greetings before sitting down. For a while nobody spoke very much. The room filled with ordinary sounds. Forks against plates. Coffee cups touching tabletops. Ceiling fans humming overhead. Then something happened that finally pushed James to act. One of the younger women unfolded a letter. The paper looked worn from repeated reading. She stared at it while holding a piece of bread in her other hand. A few moments later tears appeared in her eyes. Not dramatic tears. Not sobbing. Just quiet tears slipping down her face. Elizabeth reached over and gently touched her shoulder. The young woman nodded and folded the letter again. Across the table nobody looked surprised. It was as though they all understood. James set down his coffee cup. He had seen enough. Later that morning he found Samuel Ortiz outside the administration building. The translator listened carefully while James described what he had observed. When he finished, Samuel remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked a question. "Have you ever asked her directly?" James looked surprised. "Elizabeth." Samuel nodded. "You have spent 3 days trying to solve a mystery without speaking to the person standing in the center of it." James laughed softly. "When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous." "Because it is." Samuel smiled. "Ask her." The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. That afternoon Elizabeth was assigned to inventory medical supplies again. The clinic remained quiet. Most workers were outside performing routine duties. James arrived carrying paperwork he did not actually need to deliver. Through the open window a breeze moved the curtains gently. Sunlight crossed the floor in narrow bands. Elizabeth stood beside a shelf counting bottles. For a moment neither spoke. Then James decided to stop guessing. "May I ask you something?" She looked up. "Of course." He hesitated. Not because he lacked confidence. Because he suddenly realized the question mattered more than he had expected. The first day in the mess hall. Elizabeth's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Why were so many of you crying?" Silence settled across the room. Outside, a bird landed on the fence and immediately flew away again. Elizabeth lowered her eyes toward the clipboard in her hands. For several seconds she said nothing. James worried he had crossed a line. Then she surprised him. "Everyone keeps asking the wrong question." James frowned slightly. "What is the right question?" A faint smile touched her face. Not a happy smile. A tired one. "The question is not why we cried." She carefully placed the clipboard on the table. "The question is what we were thinking about when we cried." James remained silent. Elizabeth walked toward the window and looked outside. Beyond the clinic stretched open fields glowing beneath the afternoon sun. The sight seemed to carry her somewhere far away. "Many of the women here have families." Her voice was calm. "Parents, brothers, sisters, children. We do not know where most of them are." James listened carefully. "Some letters arrive," she continued. "Some never arrive. Some families are safe. Others." She paused. "We do not know." The room grew quiet again. Elizabeth folded her hands together. "When we sit in the mess hall we see bread, butter, coffee, sugar." She looked toward him. "And we think about home." James felt something tighten in his chest. Not because he fully understood yet. Because he was beginning to. Elizabeth continued, speaking softly. "The young woman you saw this morning received a letter last week." Her eyes drifted toward the window again. Her mother wrote that there was almost no coffee, no sugar, very little bread. She swallowed gently before continuing. The letter said they were sharing everything they had. James suddenly remembered the wrapped bread rolls, the folded napkins, the sugar packets hidden inside cloth pouches, pieces of a puzzle slowly moving into place. Elizabeth looked back at him. "When people ask why we cry, they think it is because of what is in front of us." Her voice became almost a whisper. "Most of the time we cry because of who is not sitting beside us." For several seconds neither spoke. The breeze moved through the room again. Somewhere outside, distant laughter drifted across the camp. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. James finally understood that the mystery had never been about food at all. It was about distance. About memory. About people sitting safely at a table while wondering whether someone they loved had enough to eat thousands of miles away. And for the first time since the women arrived at Camp Mason, he realized he had been looking at the situation through the wrong lens entirely. After that conversation, the camp looked different to Lieutenant James Walker. Nothing had physically changed. The fences still stretched across the Texas fields. The watchtower still stood against the sky. The same trucks arrived every morning carrying supplies. The same cooks prepared meals before sunrise. Yet something inside him had shifted. Once a person understood the reason behind a silence, the silence no longer sounded the same. Over the next several days, he found himself noticing details he had overlooked before. During breakfast, he watched the women unfold letters whose paper had become soft from being read too many times. During lunch, he noticed how carefully they saved every unused item. During dinner, he saw the way conversations occasionally stopped when someone mentioned home. Not because they wished to avoid the subject, because home was always present whether they spoke about it or not. One afternoon, a shipment of mail arrived at Camp Mason. The mail clerk carried 2 canvas sacks into the administration office and began sorting envelopes by name. Most weeks, only a handful of letters arrived from overseas. International delivery remained slow and unpredictable. Some letters crossed the Atlantic in weeks. Others took months. Some never appeared at all. James happened to be nearby when Samuel Ortiz entered carrying a stack of translated correspondence. "More letters today," Samuel said. The clerk nodded. "A few for the women." Samuel smiled faintly. "That will make their day." But later, James realized the truth was more complicated. Letters could bring comfort. They could also bring worry. That evening, he saw Elizabeth sitting alone beneath a large oak tree near the edge of the compound. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass. In her hands rested a freshly opened envelope. For several minutes, she simply stared at the paper. Not reading, thinking. James almost walked past. Then she noticed him and offered a polite nod. "Good evening, Lieutenant." "Good evening." He hesitated before speaking again. "Good news." Elizabeth looked down at the letter. A small smile appeared. "Mostly." The answer carried enough weight that James understood immediately. Mostly meant some good news and some difficult news. Mostly meant life continuing despite uncertainty. Mostly meant reality. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her pocket. Neither spoke for a moment. A warm breeze moved through the oak branches overhead. Somewhere beyond the fence, cattle grazed across the fading landscape. Finally, Elizabeth looked toward the horizon. "My younger sisters are alive." James felt genuine relief. "That is wonderful news." She nodded. "Yes." Then she added quietly, "They have very little, but they are alive." The words settled between them. Very little. James thought about how casually Americans use that phrase. A pantry running low. A grocery shelf temporarily empty. Yet he suspected the meaning was entirely different in the letter Elizabeth had received. "How old are they?" he asked. 14 and 17. A faint smile touched her face. "They used to argue about everything." The memory seemed to warm her. "Now I would be happy just to hear them arguing again." James smiled softly. He understood that feeling more than he expected. Back in Kansas, his younger brother had spent years irritating everyone in the family. Yet after leaving home for military service, James discovered that even annoyance could become something worth missing. As the sun dropped lower, Elizabeth removed a folded photograph from the envelope. She stared at it for several seconds before offering it to him. The image showed 3 young girls standing in front of a small house. The photograph appeared several years old. Time had softened its edges. "That is us," she said. James studied the picture. 3 sisters. Ordinary smiles. Ordinary clothes. An ordinary moment frozen forever. There was something powerful about seeing it. Not because the image itself was extraordinary, because it reminded him that before uniforms, before camps, before oceans separated families, these had simply been people living ordinary lives. He handed the photograph back carefully. Elizabeth returned it to the envelope with the same attention she gave every valuable object. The gesture suddenly reminded James of the bread rolls and sugar packets. The connection became impossible to ignore. "Elizabeth," he said, "can I ask something?" "Of course." "The things you save from the mess hall." Her eyes lifted toward him. He continued gently. "The bread. The sugar. The butter." For a moment she remained silent. Then she surprised him again. "Would you like to see?" The next morning she provided the answer. Shortly after breakfast, she invited James and Samuel to the barracks storage room where several women kept personal belongings. The room was simple. Wooden shelves. Metal trunks. A few crates stacked against the wall. Nothing remarkable. Yet on one shelf sat a collection of carefully organized bundles wrapped in cloth and paper. Small parcels. Neatly labeled. Meticulously prepared. Elizabeth walked toward them. These belonged to different women. James examined the packages. Some contained letters. Others contained family photographs. A few held small food items preserved as carefully as precious jewelry, sugar packets, crackers, wrapped bread, tiny portions of coffee sealed inside paper. He looked at Samuel. Neither man spoke. Elizabeth picked up one bundle and held it gently. "When mail service improves," she explained, "we hope to send these home." James stared at the package in her hands. Suddenly everything became clear. The tears, the bread, the careful saving of ordinary things. The women had never been collecting food for themselves. They were building gifts. Tiny acts of hope intended for families thousands of miles away. Families they might never see again. Families they feared were struggling. For several seconds nobody spoke. Sunlight streamed through the storage room window and illuminated the small packages resting on the shelf. They looked humble, fragile, almost insignificant. Yet James felt a lump rise in his throat, because he finally understood what had been hidden inside every tear he had witnessed in the mess hall. It was not gratitude. It was not sadness alone. It was love traveling across an ocean with nowhere to go except into small bundles of bread and sugar. The discovery spread through Lieutenant James Walker's mind long after he left the storage room. For the rest of that day, every ordinary object seemed to carry a different meaning. A packet of sugar was no longer just sugar. A piece of bread was no longer just bread. The small bundles resting on those shelves represented something much larger than food. They were messages, promises, evidence that people separated by an ocean still belonged to one another. The realization stayed with him during supper that evening. The mess hall buzzed with its usual sounds. Trays slid across counters. Coffee poured into cups. Conversations drifted between tables. Yet James could no longer look at the women the same way. He found himself watching the care with which they handled even the simplest items. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Across the room, Elizabeth sat with several other women. One of them unfolded a letter while another carefully wrapped 2 sugar packets inside a handkerchief. They spoke quietly among themselves. Occasionally someone smiled. Occasionally someone stared down at the table in silence. The emotions moved back and forth like sunlight behind clouds. Hope, worry, gratitude, uncertainty, all existing at the same time. After dinner, James remained in the mess hall helping Frank Reynolds stack supply inventories. The cook wiped his forehead with a towel and nodded toward the departing prisoners. "I heard you finally solved your mystery." James looked up. "Maybe part of it." Frank placed a crate on the floor. "What was it?" For a moment James searched for the right words. Then he realized there were none simple enough. "They are thinking about their families." Frank nodded slowly. "Aren't we all?" The answer lingered. Because it was true. Every American in Camp Mason carried photographs, letters, memories. Men spoke about wives in Ohio, parents in Kansas, children in Texas. Separation was not unique to the prisoners. The difference was uncertainty. Most of the American personnel knew where home was. They expected to return. Many of the women did not even know whether home still looked the same. The next morning brought a steady rain. Not a storm. Just a gentle Texas rain that turned the roads dark and filled the air with the scent of wet earth. Work details moved indoors where possible. The clinic became busier. The warehouse filled with workers sorting supplies. The rain drummed softly against rooftops throughout the morning. Shortly before noon, Samuel Ortiz entered James's office carrying several translated letters. More correspondence arrived. James looked up from his desk. "Good news." Samuel gave a small shrug. "Some good, some difficult." He placed the papers down. Life rarely arrives in neat categories. As Samuel prepared to leave, one document caught James's attention. It was not a personal letter. It was a report from a relief organization discussing conditions in parts of post-war Europe. Food shortages, transportation problems, families waiting for supplies. Nothing dramatic, nothing sensational, just facts, quiet facts, the kind that often carried the greatest weight. James read the report twice, then a third time. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and stared out the rain-covered window. Suddenly the tears in the mess hall made even more sense than before. He had assumed the women were grieving distance. But distance was only part of it. They were grieving helplessness. Every day they sat in safety while wondering how to help people they could not reach. Every day they received meals while imagining empty tables elsewhere. That afternoon he encountered Elizabeth in the clinic again. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. She was organizing medical records when James entered. "I read something this morning," he said. Elizabeth looked up. "About Europe?" He nodded. She seemed unsurprised. "Many reports are arriving now." James hesitated. "Is that why you save everything?" For a moment she remained quiet. Then she closed the folder in her hands. "May I tell you a story?" "Of course." Elizabeth walked toward the window. Outside, rain streaked across the glass. "When I was a little girl, my grandmother kept a cupboard." A faint smile touched her face. "Nothing special. Just an old wooden cupboard." James listened carefully. Every time she baked bread, she saved a little flour. Every time she bought sugar, she saved a spoonful. Her eyes drifted toward the rain. "I once asked why." She paused. "She told me that difficult times never announce their arrival. They simply appear one day." The room fell silent. "And now?" James asked softly. Elizabeth smiled sadly. "Now I understand what she meant." She looked toward him. "The women are not saving food because they are hungry." Her voice remained calm. "They are saving hope because someone they love might be." The words settled heavily between them. Not because they were dramatic, because they were simple. Simple truths often carried the most weight. Later that evening, James walked through the storage room again. The shelves remained lined with carefully wrapped bundles. Small packages prepared with extraordinary care. He stood there alone for several minutes, looking, thinking, understanding. Then he noticed something he had missed before. Attached to many of the bundles were names. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers. Entire lives reduced to neat handwriting on folded paper labels. One package simply read, "For Marta." Another, "For Mother." Another, "For Anna and Greta." The names transformed everything. Suddenly the shelves no longer held anonymous parcels. They held relationships, memories, futures. James reached out and lightly touched one label. The paper felt thin beneath his fingers. Yet the emotion behind it felt immeasurable. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Evening sunlight broke through the clouds and painted the camp in gold. Water glistened on rooftops. Birds emerged from shelter. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Texas countryside. And standing alone among those shelves, Lieutenant James Walker realized that the women had never been crying over what they received. They had been crying over what they wished they could give. The change began quietly. No announcement was made. No orders were issued. No meeting was called. Yet over the next week, something shifted inside Camp Mason. Lieutenant James Walker noticed it first among the kitchen staff. Frank Reynolds began setting aside extra empty paper envelopes that would normally have been discarded. One of the bakers started saving clean wrapping paper from supply shipments. A clerk in the administration office donated several unused pencils. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of things people rarely noticed until someone needed them. James never directly asked anyone to help. Somehow the story traveled on its own. Perhaps Samuel mentioned it. Perhaps Frank did. Perhaps people simply paid attention. Whatever the reason, the knowledge spread quietly through the camp. The German women were not collecting food because they wanted more for themselves. They were trying to send pieces of hope home. That understanding changed how many of the Americans viewed the bundles on those storage shelves. One afternoon, James entered the warehouse and found Corporal Robert Hayes standing beside a crate. Robert was a practical man from Oklahoma, who rarely discussed emotions and never volunteered for unnecessary conversations. Yet there he stood holding 3 unopened packs of writing paper. "I heard some of them write letters every week," Robert said casually. James nodded. "Most of them do." Robert placed the paper on a nearby table. "Then they might need this." He immediately turned and walked away before James could respond. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet it remained with him the rest of the day. Similar moments followed. A mechanic contributed several postage envelopes he had been saving. A nurse donated extra stationery. One cook began setting aside small portions of coffee that could legally be included in approved care packages. None of it was dramatic. None of it attracted attention. Yet together the contributions slowly accumulated. By the end of the week, the storage room looked different. The shelves still contained the carefully wrapped bundles prepared by the women. But now additional supplies sat beside them. Paper, pencils, envelopes, small comforts, small possibilities. One evening Elizabeth entered the room and stopped abruptly. For a moment she simply stared. The new items rested neatly on a table near the window. She turned toward James, who happened to be checking inventory records nearby. "Where did these come from?" she asked softly. James glanced at the supplies. "Around the camp." Elizabeth remained silent. Her eyes moved slowly from one item to the next. Finally she picked up a package of stationery. The paper looked ordinary, cream-colored, nothing special. Yet she held it carefully, almost reverently. "They did this." James nodded. "Looks that way." Elizabeth swallowed gently. "Why?" The question lingered in the room. James thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe because people understand more than we think they do." Elizabeth looked down at the stationery again. The expression on her face was difficult to describe. Gratitude was part of it. Surprise too. But there was something deeper beneath both emotions. Something quieter. The feeling of discovering that kindness could appear from unexpected directions. A few days later, permission arrived for a limited shipment of personal parcels through approved relief channels. The process was complicated. Regulations were strict. Space was limited. Yet it was possible. When the news spread among the women, excitement mixed with nervous energy. For the first time, many of them could imagine something tangible reaching their families. The storage room became busier than ever. Women sorted letters, rewrapped packages, checked addresses, compared translations. Every item was inspected carefully. Every detail mattered. One afternoon James entered and found Elizabeth sitting at a table beneath the window. Sunlight streamed across the wood surface. In front of her lay a small package addressed to her sisters. She was carefully folding a letter. Nearby rested several sugar packets, a packet of coffee, and a family photograph she had copied onto fresh paper to protect the original. James paused several feet away. "Getting close." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "I think so." She slid the letter into the package and tied a string around it. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately. "I keep wondering if it will actually arrive. I hope it does." She looked toward him. "So do I." For a moment neither spoke. Then Elizabeth reached into her pocket and removed the photograph of the three sisters standing in front of their house. The edges were worn now. Time had softened the image. She stared at it briefly before placing a duplicate copy inside the parcel. "If they receive nothing else," she said quietly, "at least they will know I am still thinking about them every day." James looked at the package resting on the table. It was not large. It could fit easily into both hands. Yet somehow it seemed heavier than anything else in the room. Because inside it traveled far more than paper and sugar. Inside it traveled memory, hope, love. And as evening sunlight filled the storage room with gold, James realized that the mystery he had been chasing since the first day in the mess hall had completely transformed. He had started by asking why the women were crying. Now he understood that the more important question was what people chose to do after they understood the answer. The morning the parcels were scheduled to leave Camp Mason arrived clear and bright. The storm clouds from earlier in the week had disappeared, leaving behind a sky so blue it seemed to stretch forever above the Texas countryside. Long before sunrise, lights glowed inside several barracks. Sleep had become difficult. Too much anticipation filled the air. For many of the women, this was the first moment in months when they felt they were doing something tangible for the people waiting across the Atlantic. The storage room became the center of activity. Packages were checked one final time. Labels were reviewed. Addresses were verified through translators and relief records. Every string was tightened. Every envelope inspected. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was treated casually. Lieutenant James Walker arrived shortly after 7 o'clock. Sunlight streamed through the windows and illuminated rows of carefully prepared parcels resting on the tables. They varied in size. Some contained only letters and photographs. Others included small food items permitted under regulations. A few held handmade notes folded neatly beside family pictures. Looking across the room, James was struck by how ordinary everything appeared. Brown paper, string, pencil markings. Yet behind every parcel stood an entire story. A mother waiting for news. A younger sister hoping a letter might arrive. A father wondering whether his daughter was still alive. The room carried a quiet energy unlike anything he had experienced during the war. Not fear. Not tension. Hope. Pure hope. Elizabeth Bauer stood near one of the tables holding the package addressed to her sisters. She wore the same simple uniform she had worn since arriving at the camp, but something about her posture seemed lighter. Not carefree, just lighter. When she noticed James entering, she offered a small smile. Today is the day. James nodded. Looks that way. She glanced toward the package in her hands. I have imagined this moment many times. Her fingers rested gently on the folded paper wrapping. Now that it is here, it feels unreal. Across the room, several other women shared similar expressions. One carefully smoothed the corner of an envelope. Another reread a letter she had already reviewed half a dozen times. A third sat quietly holding a family photograph before placing it inside a package and sealing it for the final time. Samuel Ortiz arrived carrying official shipping forms. The process took most of the morning. Signatures, inventory records, documentation, necessary procedures that felt unusually important. Around noon, a transport vehicle backed up beside the warehouse loading area. The driver stepped out and began checking paperwork. The moment had arrived. One by one, the parcels were carried outside. No speeches were made. No ceremony had been planned. Yet nearly everyone nearby paused to watch. Kitchen workers stepped outside. Mechanics paused their repairs. Clerks looked up from their desks. Even some of the guards drifted toward the loading area. The packages were not large. Together they occupied only a small section of the truck. Yet the sight of them being loaded created a silence that spread through the crowd. Elizabeth stood beside James as the final parcels disappeared into the vehicle. Neither spoke for a while. The afternoon breeze moved gently across the camp. Dust swirled along the road. Somewhere beyond the fence, a windmill turned slowly against the sky. Finally Elizabeth broke the silence. Do you know what I kept thinking about? James looked toward her. She watched the truck carefully. The first day. He understood immediately. The mess hall. The tears. The confusion. Elizabeth smiled softly. Everyone thought we were crying because of what we had received. Her eyes remained fixed on the vehicle. But we were thinking about what we could not give. James nodded. The truth felt simple now. Obvious even. Yet it had taken days to understand. A driver closed the rear doors. Metal latches clicked into place. The sound echoed across the loading area. For a moment nobody moved. Then the engine started. The truck slowly rolled forward. The women watched silently as it traveled down the camp road. No cheering followed. No dramatic farewell. Only quiet observation. The kind that carried more meaning than words. Elizabeth continued watching until the vehicle disappeared beyond a line of trees near the front gate. Only then did she lower her eyes. James noticed moisture gathering there. Not tears of sadness. Something more complicated. Relief. Hope. Uncertainty. Gratitude. Emotions blending together. I hope they receive it, he said. Elizabeth smiled. So do I. Then she surprised him with another thought. But even if they do not. She paused. At least I know I tried. The statement lingered long after the truck vanished. Later that evening, the camp returned to its normal rhythm. Supper was served. Workers finished their assignments. The sun settled toward the horizon. Yet something felt different. The tension that had quietly occupied the women for weeks seemed slightly reduced. Not gone. Just lighter. At dinner, conversations flowed more easily. A few people laughed. Several women discussed what they might write in future letters. Small signs. Subtle changes. Yet James noticed all of them. After sunset he found himself walking toward the storage room. The shelves stood nearly empty now. Only a few remaining supplies rested against the walls. The packages were gone. The room felt larger than before. Quieter too. As he stood there alone, he remembered the first time he had entered this space. Back then the shelves had seemed filled with mysteries. Now they felt filled with answers. He thought about the tears in the mess hall, the folded bread, the carefully wrapped sugar packets, the letters carried in pockets. Piece by piece the story had revealed itself. Not through dramatic confessions, not through grand events, through small acts repeated every day. Acts so ordinary that most people never noticed them. Standing in the fading evening light, Lieutenant James Walker finally understood something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes the strongest evidence of love was not found in what people said. It was found in what they quietly saved for someone else. Summer gradually gave way to autumn across central Texas. The days remained warm, but the evenings carried a hint of cool air that had been absent when the German women first arrived at Camp Mason. Time moved forward the way it always did. Work details continued. Letters arrived. New assignments replaced old routines. Yet certain moments remained fixed in memory. For Lieutenant James Walker, one of those moments would always be the sight of a group of women sitting silently in a mess hall, holding tears they could not explain to strangers. Weeks passed after the parcels left the camp. Life settled into a quieter rhythm. Then one afternoon, just as the sun began dropping toward the western horizon, a new shipment of mail arrived. The mail clerk sorted envelopes across a long wooden table, while workers waited nearby. Most days produced ordinary correspondence. That day was different. Samuel Ortiz appeared at James's office carrying several letters, and one unusually thick envelope. "This came through the relief channels," Samuel said. "It is addressed to Elizabeth." James looked up from his paperwork. "Did it make it?" Samuel smiled. "It appears that it did." News traveled quickly. By evening, several women had gathered inside the barracks recreation room where Elizabeth carefully opened the envelope. No celebration erupted. No one shouted. Instead, the room became very quiet. The kind of quiet that appears when something deeply important finally arrives. Inside were several pages of handwritten notes. There were letters from both sisters. There was a small photograph. There was even a pressed flower tucked carefully between two sheets of paper. Elizabeth read silently at first. Then she covered her mouth and lowered her eyes. For a moment nobody moved. Finally she looked toward Samuel and asked if he would help translate part of the letter for James. The translator unfolded one page and began reading. The words were simple. Her sisters described ordinary things. A repaired window. A neighbor who shared vegetables from a garden. A church bell that still rang every Sunday morning. Small details. Everyday details. Yet those details carried enormous meaning because they confirmed something precious. Life continued. Then Samuel reached the final paragraph. His voice softened as he read. "The package arrived safely. We shared the coffee on a Sunday afternoon. Mother cried when she saw the photograph. Not because she was sad. Because for the first time in many months, she felt close to you again." The room fell completely silent. Elizabeth lowered her head. Tears slipped down her cheeks. This time nobody was confused by them. Nobody searched for an explanation. Everyone understood. James looked around the room. Several of the women were smiling through tears of their own. Even Samuel needed a moment before continuing. The letter contained one final sentence. A sentence that stayed with James for the rest of his life. "You sent us more than supplies. You reminded us that distance had not taken our family away." That evening, after most of the camp had settled for the night, James found himself walking toward the storage room one last time. The shelves remained mostly empty now. A few supplies sat neatly organized near the wall. Moonlight filtered through the windows. The room felt peaceful. He stood there quietly, remembering everything that had happened since the women arrived. The tears. The questions. The letters. The packages. The answers hidden inside ordinary objects. Somewhere behind him, footsteps approached. He turned and saw Elizabeth standing in the doorway. She held the photograph from her sisters in one hand. "I thought I might find you here," she said. James smiled. "Habit, I suppose." Elizabeth stepped into the room and looked around. "This place changed many things." James nodded. It did. For a moment they stood together in silence. Then Elizabeth handed him the photograph. It showed two young women standing outside a small house. Both were smiling. The image was simple, yet it carried the weight of an entire journey. James studied it carefully before returning it. They look happy. Elizabeth smiled. They are. She slipped the photograph back into its envelope. And now I know. The answer seemed to satisfy her more than anything else. Not certainty about the future. Not promises. Simply knowing. Knowing that her sisters were alive. Knowing that her package arrived. Knowing that love had successfully crossed an ocean. Years later, long after the war belonged to history books, James would still remember the lesson he learned at Camp Mason. He would remember that people often misunderstand tears because they focus only on what is visible. They see the meal. They see the bread. They see the coffee. They do not see the memories sitting beside them at the table. They do not see the faces carried inside a folded photograph. They do not see the names written on a package bound for another continent. On the final evening before several of the women were transferred to another facility, the mess hall served supper as usual. Bread. Coffee. A simple meal. Nothing remarkable. Yet this time when James looked across the room, he noticed Elizabeth holding a letter from her sisters while smiling quietly to herself. The mystery that had once puzzled everyone no longer existed. In its place stood understanding. And sometimes understanding was the greatest gift one person could offer another. Outside, the Texas sky darkened above the fields. The ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. Conversations drifted through the room. Life moved forward. But in that ordinary moment, surrounded by ordinary people, something extraordinary remained. Not the parcels. Not the letters. Not even the tears. It was the realization that the strongest connections in life are often carried by the smallest things. A photograph. A piece of bread. A packet of sugar. A few words written on paper. Quiet reminders that even across thousands of miles, the people we love remain part of us. And that was why the tears had mattered all along.